Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the endocrine system. If there's a specific topic in the endocrine system that you're looking for, I will be putting timestamps down in the description box below. I do ask that if you like this video and its contents, that you please like and share my video and subscribe to my channel so that I can continue to make these videos for you. The endocrine system is a complex system that includes several glands and hormone-secreting cells that produce hormones. These hormones interact with different organs throughout the body to create a variety of feedback loops. Before we get started, let's go ahead and define some helpful terminology. A hormone is a molecule that is released in one part of the body but works on another part of the body. Hormones are released into the bloodstream so that they can travel through the blood to get to their target organ. Hormones bind to receptors, and we're going to talk about this idea throughout this lecture. What hormones get released from where can these hormones act, what receptors do they bind to, and what do they do will be a large bit of this lecture. Now, in previous chapters, you should have come across the difference between exocrine and endocrine glands. So let's go ahead and review that so that you understand that for this chapter. Remember that exocrine glands secrete their products into ducts. And so those ducts are going to carry the secretions into different areas, whether they be body cavities, maybe the lumen of the organ, or even to the outer surface of the body, such as when you sweat. Endocrine glands secrete their product into the blood. They do this by the cells releasing the hormones into the interstitial fluid that surrounds those cells rather than into a duct. And from the interstitial fluid, those hormones can diffuse into the capillaries, and then the blood can carry the hormones to the target cells. Since we'll be talking about hormones throughout this chapter, what are the functions of the hormones? Hormones are involved in a variety of different functions, including that they help to regulate different things throughout the body, such as the chemical composition and volume of interstitial fluid, metabolism and energy balance, glandular secretions, contraction of smooth and cardiac muscle fibers, and even some immune system activities. The hormones also help to control growth and development. They regulate operation of reproductive systems. We'll talk a lot more about that later on, and then again in the male and female chapters. And they help establish circadian rhythms, those night and day cycles. Like I mentioned before, hormones are released into the blood to travel throughout the body, but they only work on their target cells. The reason for this is because target cells have specific receptors on the surface of their cells that the hormones can bind to. If the receptor and hormone are not a match, then the hormone can have no effect on that cell. However, if they do match, then the hormone can bind to that receptor and the action of that hormone can go towards that cell. What the action is depends on the hormone and the cell, and we'll be talking about those specific processes as we go on. Receptors, like many other things in the body, are constantly being synthesized and broken down. Usually, a target cell can have about 2,000 to 100,000 receptors for a particular hormone. If the hormone happens to be present in excess, then the number of the receptors on the target cell may decrease. This is known as downregulation. When downregulation happens in the receptors of a target cell, this is going to make the target cell less sensitive or less responsive to a hormone. However, when the hormone is deficient, there's not a lot of the hormone in the bloodstream, this can actually increase the number of receptors on the cell, and this is known as upregulation. This would also make the cell much more sensitive to the hormone. So the more receptors a target cell has for that hormone, the more sensitive or the more responsive it will be to that hormone, and the less receptors that it has on that target cell, then it will be much less sensitive or responsive to that specific hormone. Broadly, we can classify hormones as to whether they are soluble in lipids, fats, or those which are soluble in water. Lipid-soluble hormones cross the cell membrane and interact with the genes inside the cell. Water-soluble hormones will interact with a receptor on the outside of the cell and then cause a cascade of events to happen within the cell. First, let's talk about the different lipid-soluble hormones. One of those are steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. These hormones include aldosterone, cortisol, androgens, calcitriol, testosterone, estrogens, and progesterone. The site of secretion for these hormones include the adrenal cortex, kidneys, testes, and ovaries. Another type of lipid-soluble hormone are thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are synthesized by attaching iodine to the amino acid tyrosine. These hormones include T3 triiodothyronine and T4 thyroxine. They are secreted by the thyroid gland from the follicular cells. The final type of lipid-soluble hormone is gas, specifically nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas that serves as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. It is secreted by the endothelial cells that line blood vessels. Now let's talk about some water-soluble hormones. The water-soluble hormones include amine hormones. Amine hormones are synthesized by modifying certain amino acids. These hormones include epinephrine, norepinephrine, melatonin, histamine, and serotonin. They are secreted by the adrenal medulla, the pineal gland, mast cells and connective tissues, and the platelets in the blood. Another type of water-soluble hormones are peptide hormones and protein hormones. Peptide hormones consist of chains of 3 to 49 amino acid. Examples of these would include antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Protein hormones are larger and include 50 to 200 amino acids in their chain. These hormones would be things like human growth hormone and insulin. These hormones make up a very large group of hormones. They include all hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormones that are secreted from the hypothalamus, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which are secreted from the posterior pituitary, human growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormone, which are secreted from the anterior pituitary, insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptide secreted from the pancreas, parathyroid hormone secreted from the parathyroid glands, calcitonin secreted from the thyroid gland parafollicular cells, gastrin, secretin, cholecytokinin, GIP, which is glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, which are secreted from the stomach and small intestine enteroendocrine cells, erythropoietin, secreted by the kidneys, and finally leptin, which is secreted by adipose tissue. The final type of water-soluble hormones are eicosanoids. They are derived from arachidonic acid, a 20-carbon fatty acid. The two major types include prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which are secreted from all cells except red blood cells. Let's take a look at how hormones travel through the blood. Most water-soluble hormones are going to circulate in the blood in their free form. This means that they are not attached to any other molecules. However, most lipid-soluble hormones are bound to transport proteins. These transport proteins are synthesized in the liver and have various functions as follows. First, since lipid hormones are not water-soluble, these transport proteins make lipid-soluble hormones temporarily water-soluble. Second, these transport proteins will inhibit the passage of small hormone molecules through the kidney's filtering mechanism. This will decrease the loss of hormones within the urine. And thirdly, these transport proteins are going to provide a ready reserve of hormones that will already be present within the bloodstream. Normally, less than about 10% of these lipid-soluble hormones are not bound to a transport protein. This constitutes what is called the free fraction. This free fraction of lipid-soluble hormones can diffuse out of the capillaries and bind to receptors. By binding to receptors, they can trigger hormonal responses. As these hormones do their work, transport proteins can release new ones to replenish this free fraction. As I have mentioned before, the response to a hormone is going to depend on the hormone and the target cell. Different target cells can respond to the same hormone in different ways. Hormones can do things such as changing the permeability of the plasma membrane, stimulating the transport of a substance into or out of the target cells. Sometimes they can even alter the rate of a metabolic reaction or even cause contraction of smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. However, one thing is certain: before a hormone can actually cause a cellular response, it must first bind to its receptor. Receptors for lipid-soluble hormones are located inside target cells, while receptors for water-soluble hormones are part of the plasma membrane of these target cells. Let's take a look at the mechanism of action of lipid-soluble hormones. First, remember again that the receptor for lipid-soluble hormones is located within the target cell. So the first thing that needs to happen with these lipid-soluble hormones is that it's going to have to detach from its transport protein and become part of the free fraction we just spoke about. Once the hormone is part of the free fraction, it can freely diffuse out of the blood capillary. After it diffuses into the blood capillary, it enters into the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, the hormone can then freely diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane into a cell. Now, this can happen because this is a lipid-soluble hormone, and therefore it can freely diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane into a cell. Now, this is not specific because like dissolves like, so the lipid can pass through the lipid, and so hormones can pass into basically any cell. So the important part is that if it is a target cell, then once that hormone comes into the cell, it will be able to bind to a receptor, only if it's a target cell. If it's not a target cell, there's going to be no receptor to bind to. So if that cell is a target cell, then the hormone can bind to and activate the receptors that would be located within the cytosol or the nucleus. Then this activated receptor hormone complex can alter gene expression by turning genes on or off. As the DNA is transcribed into mRNA, this mRNA can then leave the nucleus and enter into the cytosol. In the cytosol, it can direct the synthesis of a new protein, which is often an enzyme. Now that this new protein has been made, it can alter the cell's activity and cause the responses typical of that hormone. Now let's take a look at the mechanism of action of water-soluble hormones. Now, water-soluble hormones cannot easily diffuse through the cell membrane. So water-soluble hormones have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the target cell. When this water-soluble hormone binds to the receptor on the outside of the target cell, it is acting as a first messenger. The hormone will then stimulate the production of a second messenger on the inside of the cell. One common second messenger is cyclic AMP. So let's take a look at the steps which allow this to occur. First, the water-soluble hormone has to diffuse out of the blood capillary. Once it does so, it can bind to a receptor on its target cell, acting as a first messenger. Once this binding occurs, the enzyme adenylate cyclase can convert ATP into cyclic AMP, which occurs inside the cell. This creates that second messenger, cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is then capable of activating several enzymes. The enzymes which are activated are going to depend on the hormone and its target cell, but these activated enzymes can catalyze reactions that produce physiological responses. This is only allowed to occur briefly, and then cyclic AMP is inactivated by an enzyme called phosphodiesterase. Therefore, the cell's responses will be limited unless there is more hormone molecules to continue this response. If more hormone molecules are being released by the blood capillaries and binding to the receptors, then this response can continue. If not, then it will be shut off in that brief period by phosphodiesterase. Therefore, if hormone levels are higher, there can be longer lasting effects on the target cell than if hormone levels were lower. 3 factors are going to influence the responsiveness of a target cell to a hormone. They include the hormone's concentration in the blood, the abundance of target cell receptors, and the influences that are exerted by other hormones. Hormone secretion is regulated in 3 ways. 1, from signals from the nervous system. 2, by chemical changes in the blood. And 3rd, by other hormones. Most of the systems that are going to be used in regulating the secretion of hormones are going to work by negative feedback systems. However, there are a few that will operate by positive feedback systems. Now that you have a basic understanding of the hormones and the different types there are and the ways in which they can work, we're going to go through and discuss the various endocrine glands and the hormones that they secrete specifically. The hypothalamus is a small region of the brain that lies below the thalamus. It is an important link between the nervous and endocrine systems. The cells in the hypothalamus synthesize at least 9 different hormones. Together with the pituitary hormones, they both play an important role in the regulation of virtually all aspects of growth, development, metabolism, and homeostasis. Hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary is regulated by the hypothalamus. Releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus will stimulate hormones released from the anterior pituitary. However, inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus will suppress secretion of anterior pituitary hormones. The hormones that are secreted from the hypothalamus reach the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal system. This system links the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. The pituitary gland is a pea-shaped structure that's about 1 to 1.5 centimeters or 0.5 inches in diameter. It attaches to the hypothalamus by a stalk referred to as the infundibulum. The pituitary gland has 2 separate portions. The anterior pituitary, which is the glandular anterior lobe and accounts for about 75% of the total weight of the pituitary gland. This is the portion that produces hormones, which regulates a wide range of bodily activities, including things from growth to reproduction. The other portion of the pituitary gland is referred to as the posterior pituitary. This portion is composed of nervous tissue, but does not produce any hormones. However, it does release hormones that are synthesized by the hypothalamus. We are going to take a look at the hormones of the anterior pituitary, what cells they're released from, and what their actions are. Remember, as I've mentioned before, neurosecretory cells that are found in the hypothalamus can secrete releasing hormones, which are going to stimulate the secretion of these anterior pituitary hormones, or they can also release inhibiting hormones, which are going to suppress the secretion of these anterior pituitary hormones. So the hypothalamus has control on the release or inhibition of the anterior pituitary hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated ACTH, is also called corticotropin. This hormone is released by the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary. This hormone stimulates the production and secretion of glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, by the outer cortex of the adrenal glands. Corticotropin releasing hormone, abbreviated CRH, which is released from the hypothalamus, is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone. Let's take a look at how the hypothalamus affects the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, from the anterior pituitary, okay? So for instance, if you have corticotropin releasing hormone that is being released from the hypothalamus, then that is going to cause the release of corticotropin or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which we just talked about, from the anterior pituitary. This is going to then be released into the bloodstream and allowed to work its action, which is stimulating the secretion of cortisol by the adrenal cortex. So it will travel in the blood to the adrenal cortex where it will cause the release of cortisol. That is as long as corticotropin releasing hormone is being secreted. So this is going to go in this direction. However, most hormones are affected by negative feedback. And so what we see is that as cortisol levels increase in the blood, this is going to cause a negative feedback. So where you see the red lines, we're going to have some negative feedback for that. So cortisol levels will then start to increase in the blood if corticotropin releasing hormone is released, causing release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to act on the adrenal cortex. We're going to have cortisol. So that's going to increase cortisol levels. When cortisol levels get too high, then we can have the inhibition occur, okay? And so high levels of cortisol are actually going to feedback negatively, and they're going to inhibit release of corticotropin by the anterior pituitary and also inhibit release of the corticotropin releasing hormone. So this is going to result in negative feedback. So we want to keep the levels of cortisol in the body stable, and to do this as cortisol levels increase, cortisol itself is actually going to negatively feedback to both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to stop the release of both corticotropin releasing hormone and corticotropin. Once cortisol levels drop down again, then we can start this feedback mechanism again. So this is an example of how negative feedback can work between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Human growth hormone, abbreviated HGH, is secreted by the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary. This hormone is the most plentiful hormone produced by the anterior pituitary. The main function of this hormone is to promote the synthesis and secretion of small protein hormones called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. The different functions of IGFs include increasing growth rate, increasing lipolysis, and elevating blood glucose. They are so named because some of their actions are very similar to those of insulin. The hypothalamic hormones that control the secretion of HGH include growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So before, when we took a look at corticotropin releasing hormone and corticotropin, what we notice is that cortisol that was secreted by the adrenal cortex actually goes back and negatively inhibits both those hormones. So the product is actually doing the inhibition. In this case, for human growth hormone, what we're going to see is that the secretion of human growth hormone is going to be stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and that's what you can see On this side over here, okay, growth hormone releasing hormone is going to stimulate the release of human growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone is going to inhibit the release. So rather than the product actually doing the inhibition, there are two hormones, the stimulating hormone or the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and the inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus are going to have the effects on human growth hormone. So if blood glucose is low, okay, low blood glucose itself is going to cause the release of the growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which is then going to cause the release of the human growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. This is going to then in turn speed up the release of glucose by the liver, and then the blood glucose can return to normal. On the other hand, if the blood glucose is too high, this is then going to cause the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus, and this is going to inhibit the release of human growth hormone. When the human growth hormone is inhibited, then this is going to decrease the release of glucose by the liver, and this will allow the blood glucose level to return back to normal. So in this case, the hormones from the hypothalamus are going to either stimulate the release of human growth hormone or inhibit the release of human growth hormone based on blood glucose levels. Let's finish our discussion of the anterior pituitary with the remaining hormones that we find there. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is released by the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary. This hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to synthesize and secrete the two thyroid hormones, triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, from the hypothalamus is actually going to control TSH secretion. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, is released by the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary. This hormone has different effects in males or females. In males, it's going to stimulate the testes to produce sperm, and in females, it's going to initiate the development of oocytes and induces ovarian secretion of estrogen. Gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone is a hormone that is also released by the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary. In females, this hormone is responsible for the secretion of estrogen and progesterones, ovulation, and the formation of the corpus luteum. In males, this hormone is going to stimulate the testes to produce testosterone. Prolactin is a hormone that is released by the lactotrophs of the anterior pituitary. This hormone works together with other hormones to promote milk production by the mammary glands in females. The hypothalamus secretes both prolactin-releasing hormone, which causes release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary, and prolactin-inhibiting hormone, which inhibits the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. And finally, we have melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which is released by the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary. We don't know the exact role of this hormone in humans, but there are receptors for this hormone in the brain, which suggests that it may influence brain activity. We do also know that when this hormone is present in excess, it can cause darkening of the skin. Excess levels of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus can stimulate the release of melanocyte stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. And prolactin inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus can inhibit melanocyte-stimulating hormone release from the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis. Though it does not synthesize hormones, it does store and release two hormones. These two hormones include oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. These hormones are produced by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus and then are packed into vesicles and transported to the axon terminals that lie within the posterior pituitary. Here they are stored until impulses trigger exocytosis and release of these hormones. The hormones within the vesicles are then released and diffuse into the capillaries of the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is a hormone that affects the mother's uterus and breasts during and after delivery of a baby. During delivery, oxytocin is the hormone that is going to cause contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus. After delivery of the baby, oxytocin stimulates milk ejection from the mammary glands. This is released in response to the suckling of the baby during nursing. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone which causes the kidneys to reabsorb more water, returning that water to the blood rather than losing the water in the urine. This in turn decreases urine volume while helping to increase blood volume. Antidiuretic hormone also causes constriction of the arterioles. Together with increasing water retention, these things will increase blood pressure. The hormone's other name is vasopressin, which reflects its effect on blood pressure. The pathway of this hormone and the effects on retaining water and increasing blood pressure will be discussed in greater detail in my lecture on the urinary system. The thyroid gland is located just inferior or below the larynx or voice box. It is composed of right and left lobes, one on either side of the trachea, but is connected by an isthmus. The majority of the thyroid is made up of spherical sacs, which are called thyroid follicles. Within these follicles are glandular cells, which are called follicular cells. These are the cells responsible for producing two hormones found within the thyroid gland, triiodothyronine, or T3, and thyroxine, or T4. Other cells found within the thyroid gland include parafollicular cells. These lie between the follicles. These cells produce a hormone referred to as calcitonin, which helps to regulate calcium homeostasis. The thyroid gland is the only gland that actually stores its secretory product in extremely large quantities. In the thyroid gland, there is normally about 100-day supply. Let's talk about the synthesis and secretion of T3 and T4 using this figure to follow along. The first thing that happens here is that thyroid follicular cells are going to trap iodide ions by actively transporting them from the blood into the cytosol of the cells. The other thing that's happening within these follicular cells is that they are synthesizing thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is secreted into the lumen of the follicle. So what happens after these iodide molecules come into the cell, they are oxidated, which means removing of electrons, transforming them into active forms referred to as iodine molecules. These iodine molecules are going to pass out of the cell into the follicular cavity along with the thyroglobulin that was also made within the cell will be secreted into the follicular cavity. As this is happening, the thyroglobulin is going to bind with the iodine molecules, and together these are going to form a sticky material that is referred to as colloid that accumulates in the lumen of the follicle. So you can see that would be occurring here, and if you look at the bigger picture here, that would be here in the follicular cavity that this would be accumulating. Droplets of colloid are going to re-enter the cell by pinocytosis or cell drinking, which is a form of endocytosis. Once they re-enter the cell through this form, they are going to merge with lysozymes. The enzymes within the lysozymes are going to break the thyroid globulin from the molecules of T3 and T4, releasing them back into the cytosol of the cell. Because T3 and T4 are lipid-soluble hormones, they are going to easily be able to diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. Once they do this, they would enter into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood capillaries. Once in the bloodstream, they are going to be bound together with transport proteins referred to as thyroid binding globulins. The majority of them will bind to these proteins, about 75% of them will bind to these proteins within the blood and be released as needed. About 90% of all thyroid secretions is T4. While T3 is secreted in relatively small amounts, the effects of T3 are much stronger than those of T4. Since most body cells have receptors for thyroid hormones, both T3 and T4, they are capable of exerting their effects throughout the body. The actions of the thyroid hormones include: they increase basal metabolic rate, they can stimulate cells to use large amounts of ATP, thus playing a role in the maintenance of normal body temperature. They stimulate protein synthesis and increase the use of glucose and fatty acids for ATP production. They increase the breakdown of triglycerides. They enhance some actions of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And they can stimulate body growth, particularly the growth of the nervous and skeletal systems. Embedded into the posterior surface of the thyroid gland are 4 small round masses referred to as the parathyroid glands. Within the parathyroid glands, there are numerous chief cells. These are responsible for producing parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone regulates calcium, magnesium, and phosphate ions in the blood. Parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast activity. When osteoclast activity is increased, they digest the extracellular matrix of the bone. This releases calcium and phosphate ions into the blood. Parathyroid hormone can also act on the kidneys during urine formation by decreasing calcium and magnesium urinary loss while increasing the loss of phosphate ions in the urine. Because more phosphate ions are lost in the urine than is gained from the bones, parathyroid hormone decreases blood phosphate levels and increases calcium and magnesium levels in the blood. Another effect that parathyroid hormone has on the kidneys is to promote the formation of the hormone calcitriol. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. Calcitriol will increase the rate of calcium, phosphate, and magnesium absorption from food within the gastrointestinal tract, thus increasing the calcium, phosphate, and magnesium levels within the blood. The calcium levels in the blood directly control the secretion of both calcitonin and parathyroid hormone through negative feedback mechanisms. The adrenal glands contain 2 functionally distinct regions: an adrenal cortex, which is a large peripheral area, and an adrenal medulla, which would be the middle portion of the adrenal glands. The adrenal cortex is responsible for producing steroid hormones that are essential for life. The adrenal cortex is subdivided into 3 zones. The outer zone, just deep to the connective tissue capsule, is going to be the area that secretes hormones called mineralocorticoids. These are so called because they affect mineral homeostasis. The middle zone secretes glucocorticoids. They affect glucose homeostasis. And finally, the inner zone of the adrenal cortex would be the one that secretes weak androgens. These steroid hormones have masculinizing effects. Aldosterone is the major mineralocorticoid released by the outer zone of the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone increases the reabsorption of sodium from the urine into the blood and therefore also increases water reabsorption from the urine into blood. This will increase blood volume and help to adjust blood pressure as well as blood volume. It also stimulates the excretion of potassium from the blood into the urine. The secretion of aldosterone is controlled by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. This is a pathway that I will discuss more in the urinary chapter. The glucocorticoids that are released by the adrenal cortex include cortisol, hydrocortisone, corticosterone, and cortisone. Glucocorticoids have the following effects. They are involved in protein breakdown, glucose formation, the breakdown of triglycerides, resistance to stress, anti-inflammatory effects, and depression of immune responses. Cortisol is the most abundant glucocorticoid, accounting for about 95% of glucocorticoid activity. In both males and females, weak androgens are secreted in small amounts. After puberty in males, the testes release great deals of testosterone. So the small amount of weak androgens released from the adrenal cortex is usually so low that their effects are insignificant in males. However, in females, adrenal androgens do play important roles. They contribute to libido and are converted into estrogens by other body tissues. The inner middle region of the adrenal glands is referred to again as the adrenal medulla. This portion is a modified sympathetic ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. However, its neurons lack axons. And rather than secreting neurotransmitters, the neurons of the adrenal medulla secrete hormones. The two major hormones that are synthesized by the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine. They are also referred to as adrenaline and noradrenaline. These hormones intensify the sympathetic responses and are involved in the flight or fight response of the body. They increase heart rate, the force of contraction of the heart, and therefore the general output of the heart, which also increases blood pressure. They also increase blood flow to various organs of the body, including heart, liver, skeletal muscle, and adipose tissue. The pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. We'll talk about the endocrine functions here and look more at the exocrine functions during the digestive system chapter. Within the pancreas, there are two different clusters of cell. Acinized cells, which are part of the exocrine function of the pancreas, and pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans that are involved in the endocrine function of the pancreas. The alpha cells of the pancreatic islets secrete glucagon, while the beta cells of the pancreatic islets secrete insulin. Together, both these hormones are involved in regulating blood glucose levels. Let's take a look at how blood glucose levels are regulated by negative feedback systems, which involve both glucagon and insulin. Let's first take a look at what happens when blood glucose levels are low. So that's the stimulus, and it's detected by the glucagon-releasing cells of the pancreas, which are the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets. So the alpha cells detect that blood glucose levels are low, and they can then release glucagon. Glucagon would then travel into the blood, and the target for glucagon is going to be the liver. When glucagon gets to the liver, it's going to cause the liver to release the glycogen stores, break them down, and create more glucose. So when we break down glycogen, we can get more glucose out of there. That glucose is then released into the blood, and it starts to increase blood glucose levels. As blood glucose levels start to rise, then the body is going to return back to homeostasis. Once those levels are brought back to normal, this mechanism is going to stop because it's reversing the change. This is negative feedback. We started with declining blood glucose levels and we're bringing it back to its set point. What about the reverse? What happens when blood glucose levels are too high? So in this case, the stimulus is going to be rising blood glucose level. What's going to happen here is that high blood glucose level is going to be detected by the insulin secreting cells of the pancreas, which are those beta cells in the islet of Langerhans. Those beta cells are then going to release insulin into the blood. Insulin is a carrier for glucose and therefore is going to increase the uptake of glucose into the body cells and also into the liver for excess glucose so that it can be stored as glycogen. As the glucose is taken out of the blood and into the cells and the liver, the blood glucose levels are going to decline back to the set point. Once it reaches the set point again, or homeostasis, this feedback mechanism is going to stop. So obviously, there's a balance that happens between insulin and glucagon on a daily basis as you eat meals and increase glucose levels, and then later on your glucose levels decrease as you're starting to get hungry. So insulin and glucagon are constantly being released so that you're maintaining blood glucose levels at a constant level. If you're not able to do that, then there's probably some underlying disease such as diabetes. The ovaries are the female gonads. They are paired organs that are located in the female pelvic cavity and produce the female sex hormones, estrogens and progesterone. Estrogens and progesterone, along with other gonadotropic hormones of the anterior pituitary, regulate the female reproductive cycle, maintain pregnancy, prepare mammary glands for lactation, and promote development and maintenance of female secondary sex characteristics. The ovaries also produce relaxin and inhibin. Relaxin is a hormone that increases the flexibility of the pubic symphysis during pregnancy. It also helps to dilate the uterine cervix during labor and delivery. Inhibin is a hormone that inhibits the secretion of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Later on, in the reproductive chapter, we will go into more detail on how these hormones work together. The male gonads, which are the testes, are oval glands that lie in the scrotum. The testes produce and secrete testosterone, which is the primary male androgen. Testosterone stimulates the descent of the testes before birth. It also regulates sperm production and is responsible for promoting the development and maintenance of male secondary sex characteristics. The testes also secrete inhibin. Inhibin is going to inhibit the secretion of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Again, these hormones will be discussed in more detail when we get to the reproductive system chapter. The pineal gland is found attached to the roof of the third ventricle of the brain. This gland secretes melatonin. Melatonin is involved with the setting of the body's biological clock, which is controlled by the hypothalamus. As it becomes darker, the body releases more melatonin, and so this hormone is thought to promote sleepiness. The thymus is located between the lungs and behind the sternum. The thymus plays a role in immunity and is therefore discussed in more detail during the immune chapter. The hormones produced by the thymus include thymosin, thymic humoral factor, thymic factor, and thymopoietin. All of these are going to work together to promote the maturation of T cells, which is a type of white blood cell that works in immune defense. As far as other organs that also secrete hormones, this table summarizes those. You can find some in the gastrointestinal tract that will be involved in digestion. There are hormones released by the placenta, which would be released during pregnancy. The kidneys also release some hormones as well. These will be talked about more in the urinary system chapter. The heart has the ability to release atrial natriuretic peptide. This helps in decreasing blood pressure and is released by the cells of the right atrium. And adipose tissue also has the ability to release leptin, which suppresses appetite and may also increase FSH and LH activity. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope that it helped you to understand the endocrine system. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write them down in the comments. Thank you.